Hello and welcome to another edition of YMIN seminar, a little short lecture presentation. Week 2. I set up a link for you on an article about millennials and the church. Hope you've read that or maybe about to and enjoyed reading that. You might find it surprising that I posted something about millennials because, of course, the students you work with tend to not be millennials. They tend to be what they call Generation Z, or post-millennials, those that follow the millennial group. However, I think, I'm guessing that about everybody in this class is probably a millennial, and so it does reflect on the context that you're in terms of people around you, people you're recruiting to help work with teenagers. Might explain some of this about millennials, might explain why it's difficult sometimes to find people or even at your church or in the community you're in, your parachurch situation, whatever it might be, who are interested in working with teens because there's just a lot less people involved maybe in church. So I think the article is interesting to define your own generation, and then we'll talk about the kids after us who are the Generation Z. Now myself, I'm actually a baby boomer. You may not have ever met anybody old enough to be a baby boomer. Well, you probably have, but I'm actually in that group. And of course, any of these generational designations don't really apply to everybody in a generation. They are generalizations, so they are somewhat true, but not. They don't define everybody that's living in that age group. But they tend to be fairly accurate in terms of overall perspectives of what people are like. And the tendency, of course, and temptation is to think about, everybody after us that we're working with, to treat them like we see the world. And we have to be constantly reevaluating that to go, how do I stay fresh? How do I change? How do I approach the culture when this next group of students sees things differently than I do? Now, at my age, when I'm working with kids like in my church, I have to really make a stretch over the generations. If you have volunteers that are older, some of you might have senior citizens working with your kids who are 70s. I've met lots of leaders around the country who work with kids on a regular basis, who are in their 70s and sometimes even 80, but they have a big stretch to try and figure out how do I communicate and connect with a different generation. So it's good for all of us to be thinking, what do I have to do that's different? For those of you who are millennials, all of you, the temptation is to not think about how this next group of kids, even though they're close in age to you folks, they might be a little more different than you're thinking about. So we've got to be careful and thoughtful about these kinds of things. So the millennial article, I think, is interesting just to be kind of a jumping off point. But really what we should probably be looking at is a little more about Generation Z. So Generation Z, kind of interesting. What are they, X, Y, Z? What are they going to do next? I think they should maybe use an Excel chart. The next column after Z is AA, so Generation AA. No, they probably already have a better name for the next group coming up. But anyway, there's going to be a couple articles. I'm going to post those links as well if you want to look at these. A couple of interesting articles, actually from November of 16, and some thoughtful things about how are millennials different than the next Generation Z. So one of the articles that I link talks a little bit about how, Generation Z kids, the kids you have today, less of an attention span. Well, no big shock. You've experienced this with students in your group, and this has always been true, I think, with teenagers that follow their leaders. I remember one time finishing a brilliant lesson with a bunch of 8th grade kids, and a girl raised her hand with a question, and I was kind of excited because it was a pretty good lesson. And she said, what time are we done? And I thought, oh yeah, that's right, junior high kids, middle school kids, they just say what they think, and she was ready to be done. Or she had a shorter attention span than me, But that's even more true now. Your generation and the next generation, it gets less and less all the time. So how do you respond to that? And how different are your kids on an item like that in terms of attention span being a little bit different? One of the articles suggests, kids are more multicultural. Again, people in their 20s and 30s are very more diverse, more multicultural. But this next group, even more so. So they have high expectations of what that means and how adults treat people who are very different than themselves and in their community, in their church, whatever it might be, worth thinking about. They have high expectations. This has been true for a while. Millennials were often seen as, teachers and parents talked about how millennials had such high expectations of everything. This next group, even more so, apparently, is what they say. Generation Z tends to apparently, think a lot about their own unique perspective. They like the individuality represented on social media that says, this is who I am, I'm different than everybody else in the world, which is true, of course, but sometimes they go probably a little too far with that. But what does that mean in terms of ministry with these kids? How do you approach kids who have such a stamp of, I am me, I'm not like anybody else, and I want to be looked at differently than anybody else? How will you minister to me? They also tend to be even more global. It's interesting to me that when I was a high school student, I can't remember anybody that went and did like a missions trip overseas. There were people who did that, but not short term very much. Even in the 80s, the 90s, it started to grow. We saw more of that. But nowadays, if I'm with a bunch of teenagers from different churches and I ask, how many of you have been on a missions trip out of the country? I mean, the number of hands go up is stunning, because they've had a chance to experience, not just in missions, but just travel, a different global sense of what's happening on planet Earth. So that increases even more. Lots of global connections. Again, media makes this easy, doesn't it? Often they have stronger connections with people from other places who are here short term, maybe studying at their school or something like that. So very interesting. So the Forbes article, the other one I mentioned, is also kind of interesting, I think. Mentions that these Generation Z tends to view life from a more guarded perspective. They've come up in a world where they know about the possibilities of what can happen, and they lived their families often through the 2008 and 9 financial crisis. They have some understanding of the post 9/11 world, and so there's a little bit about that they're kind of guarded about that. They're not necessarily optimistic in some ways. At least this is what someone's suggesting. You might feel differently, and you might want to write about that. This tech question comes up, or issue comes up so much, and it does in this article as well as the last, that this issue of technology is just so prominent. With kids today, what do you do with that kind of expectation? I've seen so many youth pastors who aren't sure what to do with the cell phone. I know groups that they have a box by the door. You come in and you put your phone in the box, and it's gone for the night. Or on a retreat, they pick it up and you have your phone available. I also know youth leaders that use that technology every week. They have students frequently voting where something's presented, and then up on the screen there comes all these the results of the poll of the group. Very fascinating, but they all have phones. The assumption is you don't say anymore like does everybody not have a phone? I mean, the assumption is generally everybody has a phone, right? So the technology is going to be so dominant, and what do you do with that kind of situation? So I guess that the discussion idea this week is to talk a little bit about ourselves, our own generation, how we view the church, how our friends do, how people that work with us and with kids view the church. We want to think about this next generation and how are they different than us. And this is going to be I would think unique to every one of you, just like it is for me. They're very different. You're in your context. The kids might be different than someone else's context, of course. But what about kids in this Generation Z group that's really markedly different than how you see things, or what frustrates you about how they don't respond that in ways that you are surprised by that? So I would think a discussion thread this week could really focus in a little bit about looking at the millennials and yourselves, but then saying, what is it about this next generation that I'm struggling to figure out? So check out those links if you can. It's always kind of fun to see a little more, look at some connections. Feel free to add links yourself in your threads and to suggest other things you've read that have come up. I tend to be, I read Time magazine a lot, so I tend to see things in Time, and I'll reflect on those things, I think, once in a while as I see things come up. But you might have some other sources beyond Google or something, that maybe is helpful for all of us. So make sure that you write about that a little bit, and give us all a chance to expand our thinking about some of these topics as we look at culture and the kids that we work with today.
It's getting better all the time.